They laughed when my sister raised her glass and called her fiancé a real American hero, and then she turned to me and said I was just the one who pushes papers in an office somewhere, like I was a footnote in my own family's story, like I hadn't spent years carrying things they would never understand. And what hurt wasn't the words, it was how easily everyone agreed, how quickly they looked away from me like that version of me was the only one that ever existed. I remember the exact moment, because the room smelled like champagne and rosemary chicken. The string lights above the patio flickered in the warm Texas night, and my mother didn't correct her, not even a glance, just a quiet sip of wine like this was normal, like I deserved it. And in that second, I realized something deeper than anger, something colder, that they had already decided who I was long before I walked through that door. If you've ever felt that kind of silence, that kind of being erased in a room full of people who are supposed to know you, then take a second to like this video, subscribe, and share where you're watching from along with your local time, but only if this story truly resonates with you, only if you've ever sat at a table and felt completely invisible. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 42 years old, and this was the night my entire family learned they had been wrong about me for over a decade. It didn't start at the engagement party, though. It started years earlier, back when leaving home meant choosing a path none of them respected. Back when my sister was already becoming the center of every room and I was learning how to exist just outside the spotlight. And even then, even before the distance, before the silence between holidays and missed calls, I understood something they didn't, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is say nothing and let people believe exactly what they want, because eventually, the truth has a way of walking into the room on its own terms, and when it does, no one is prepared for it. The first time I understood exactly how my family saw me was not at that table under the string lights. It was years earlier, standing in the doorway of our kitchen with a packed duffel bag at my feet while my sister talked over me like I was not even there, explaining to our parents how she had just landed an internship with a defense contractor, how her future was finally taking shape, how proud they should be. And I remember my father nodding slowly, the kind of nod that meant approval, the kind he had never once given me, not even when I told them I had been accepted into a leadership program that would take me across the country, not even when I said I was leaving that week, because to them it was not ambition, it was avoidance. It was me running away from a life they had already designed. My mother had folded a dish towel in her hands and said, without looking up, "I just do not understand why you would choose something so uncertain." And my sister had laughed softly, not cruel, just certain, and added, "Some people are not built for real pressure." And that was it. That was the sentence that followed me for years. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet enough to sound true. I did not argue then. Just like I did not argue tonight, I simply picked up my bag, walked out the front door, and let them believe whatever version of me made them comfortable, because explaining yourself to people who have already decided who you are is like speaking into a room with no walls. The words just disappear. Over the years, the calls became shorter, then less frequent, then mostly holidays, and even then, it was never really about me. It was updates about my sister, her promotions, her relationships, her life moving forward in ways that made sense to them, while mine remained something vague, something they could summarize in a single phrase like, "She moves around a lot," or "She works for the government," always said with that same polite distance, like they were describing a distant relative they barely remembered. I let them have that version. I let them build it, reinforce it, repeat it at dinners and gatherings, because correcting them would have required explanations I was not allowed to give, details I could not share, and more than that, it would have ruined something I had come to rely on, the advantage of being underestimated. Tonight was no different. As I stood near the edge of the patio listening to my sister retell the story of how she met Daniel, how he had served, how he had seen things most people could not handle, her voice carrying across the table with that effortless confidence she had always had, and every time she said the word hero, she glanced in my direction just long enough to make sure I understood the comparison, just long enough to remind everyone else as well. I lifted my glass slightly when someone passed by, nodded when spoken to, played the role they had written for me so well that no one questioned it, not even Daniel at first, because why would he? To him, I was exactly what I appeared to be, another quiet relative in the background, someone without a story worth asking about. But I noticed things, the way his posture shifted when certain topics came up, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his eyes moved with intention instead of curiosity. And I knew there would be a moment, not because I planned it, but because people like him are trained to notice what others ignore, and all it takes is one detail, one small thing out of place, to change everything. So I stayed where I was, just inside the light, just visible enough to be seen, but not enough to be understood, and I let the night unfold exactly the way they expected, because they had no idea that the version of me they had spent years reinforcing was about to collide with something they could not explain away. By the time the sun had dipped low enough to turn the sky into that deep amber that only lasts a few minutes, the patio had settled into a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Laughter rising in waves, glasses clinking, my sister at the center of it all like she had always been, controlling the energy without ever seeming to try, and Daniel stood beside her, composed, attentive, the kind of presence people naturally adjusted themselves around without realizing it, and I watched him the way I had learned to watch everything over the years. Not directly, not obviously, just enough to notice the details that most people missed. Vanessa was mid-story again, describing one of his deployments, her voice filled with admiration that felt almost performative, as if she needed everyone to see him the way she saw him, as if his identity reflected back on her, elevating her place in the room, and every time she emphasized his experience, she layered it with a subtle comparison, a glance in my direction, a pause, just long enough for others to follow her gaze, and then a soft smile that made it seem harmless. But it was not harmless. It was precise, intentional, and practiced. I felt it in the way conversations shifted when I stepped closer, how topics softened or redirected, how questions were never quite asked, because there was an assumption already in place that I would not have anything meaningful to add, and I allowed it, because correcting them would have required unraveling years of carefully maintained silence. And tonight was not about explaining, it was about timing. Daniel eventually moved through the crowd, greeting relatives, shaking hands, listening more than he spoke, and when he approached the small group where I stood, the conversation dipped slightly, just enough for someone to introduce me in the most predictable way possible. "This is Evelyn. She works in administration or something like that," said with a polite shrug, like the specifics did not matter, and I nodded once, offering a small smile that matched the version of me they understood, because anything more would have raised questions I was not ready to answer. Daniel extended his hand, firm but not performative, his eyes meeting mine briefly, then shifting away in that socially practiced way of moving on. And for a moment, nothing happened. Just another introduction, another dismissal, exactly as expected. And he turned slightly as someone else called his name, already preparing to step away. But then something changed, subtle, almost imperceptible. His gaze dropped for less than a second, not to my face, not to the group, but to the small, understated pin fixed just beneath the collar of my jacket, the kind of detail most people would overlook entirely, the kind of detail that only meant something if you knew exactly what you were looking at, and I saw it happen in real time. The shift, the pause, the recalculation. His hand did not fully withdraw, his posture tightened just slightly, and when his eyes returned to mine, they were no longer casual, no longer polite, they were focused, precise, measuring something that had not been there a moment ago, and in that instant, I knew he understood, not everything, but enough to recognize that the story he had been hearing all evening did not align with the person standing in front of him. I did not react, not outwardly, not even a flicker, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, not the reveal itself, but the recognition before it, the quiet realization that shifts the entire dynamic without a single word being spoken, and around us, the conversation continued. Unaware, my sister laughing, someone refilling glasses, the music carrying softly through the background, but there was a fracture now, invisible to everyone else, and it was widening with every second he stood there looking at me like he had just found something he was not supposed to see. He did not step away, not immediately, and that was the first thing that broke the rhythm of the evening, because up until that moment everything had moved exactly as expected, people rotating in and out of conversations, laughter rising and falling like it had been rehearsed, but now there was a pause, subtle but real, anchored in the way Daniel held his position in front of me a second longer than necessary, his eyes no longer scanning the room, no longer drifting, but fixed, deliberate, as if confirming something he had only seen once before and was not prepared to see here. I kept my posture relaxed, one hand lightly around the stem of my glass, shoulders squared but unremarkable, because the worst thing you can do in a moment like that is acknowledge it too early. And I had spent years learning how to let other people arrive at the truth on their own, because when they do, it lands harder, it stays longer. "You said you work in an office?" he asked, his tone neutral enough that no one else would catch it, but there was a weight behind the question, a precision that did not belong to casual conversation, and I gave the same answer I had given for years, something like that, letting the ambiguity sit there without explanation, because explanations are invitations, and I was not offering any. Vanessa reappeared at his side before the silence could stretch too far, looping her arm through his with a practiced ease, smiling at him like she had already won something, and she glanced at me again, that same look, soft on the surface, sharp underneath. "She has always been a little vague about what she does," she said lightly, drawing a few polite laughs from the group, reinforcing the version of me they all understood, the safe version, the small one, and for a second I saw him look at her, really look, not with affection, but with something closer to confusion. His attention returned to me, then to the pin again, and this time the shift was not subtle. His jaw tightened just slightly, his shoulders straightened, and the easy posture he had carried all evening disappeared, replaced by something more formal, more controlled, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep in muscle memory. Conversations around us continued, but quieter now, as if something in the air had changed and no one could quite name it. And I could feel it too, that invisible pressure that builds just before a storm, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. Vanessa kept talking, filling the space the way she always did, describing future plans, venues, guest lists, things that sounded important in the moment but felt strangely distant now, and Daniel did not interrupt her, not yet, but he was no longer listening either, his focus anchored somewhere else entirely. I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the seconds pass, letting the realization settle in him fully. Because recognition is not a single moment, it is a sequence, a series of small confirmations that stack on top of each other until there is no room left for doubt. And I could see it happening, the final pieces aligning behind his eyes. Then he leaned slightly closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough to lower his voice beneath the level of the surrounding noise. And for the first time since he had approached, he did not address me casually, did not treat me as background. His words were measured, controlled, and unmistakably deliberate. "How long have you been back stateside?" he asked. And there it was, not a guess, not a question about my job, but a recognition of something far more specific, something no one else in that circle had even considered. And I met his gaze without hesitation, without surprise, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the point where the story they believed could no longer hold itself together. And I answered simply, long enough, knowing that it was not the words that mattered, but what he had already seen, what he had already understood, and across from us. Vanessa was still smiling, still unaware that the ground beneath her version of reality had already begun to shift. Vanessa kept talking, her voice bright and effortless, completely unaware that the center of gravity in that small circle had already shifted, that the man beside her was no longer anchored to her words but to something far quieter and far more significant. And I watched it happen in real time, the subtle recalibration in Daniel's posture, the way he no longer leaned into her, but stood just slightly apart, as if creating distance without making it obvious. Because people like him do not react loudly. They adjust, they observe, they confirm. "We were just telling everyone about your last assignment," Vanessa said, turning to him with that same proud smile, expecting him to pick up the story, to reinforce the image she had been building all night. But he did not respond right away, not with enthusiasm, not with the easy confidence he had shown earlier. Instead, his eyes flicked back to me for the briefest second, and in that second, something unspoken passed between us. Not acknowledgement, not yet, but recognition of alignment, of understanding. The conversation around us began to thin, not because anyone announced it, but because people sense when something changes. Even if they cannot name it, laughter softened, voices lowered, forks paused midair, and Vanessa's smile held just a fraction longer than natural, as if she felt the shift but could not locate its source. "Daniel," she prompted gently, a hint of confusion threading through her tone, and he turned back to her, composed but no longer relaxed, and said, "Maybe later." Simple, controlled, but enough to interrupt the rhythm she had been maintaining all evening. And that was the first visible crack. I set my glass down on the table beside me, the soft sound barely audible, but in that moment it felt louder, like punctuation, like a marker between what had been and what was about to unfold. And I could feel the weight of years pressing into the space between us, every assumption, every dismissal, every quiet moment where I had chosen not to correct them, all of it converging here, not in a dramatic reveal, but in a series of small, undeniable shifts that no one could quite ignore anymore. Daniel took a step closer, not toward Vanessa, but toward me, and lowered his voice just enough that it would not carry, but close enough that the intent was unmistakable. "They really think you are just office staff," he said, not as a question, not even as a judgment, but as a statement of fact that no longer aligned with what he knew, and I gave the smallest nod, because there was no reason to deny it. That had been the narrative for years, and I had allowed it. He exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that comes when someone is recalibrating their entire understanding of a situation, and then he straightened fully, his expression settling into something formal, something deliberate. And that was when I knew the moment had passed from internal recognition into external consequence. Vanessa stepped closer again, her hand tightening slightly around his arm, her smile returning but thinner now, more searching. "What is going on?" she asked, half laughing, as if expecting a simple answer that would restore everything back to normal. But there are moments that do not reverse once they begin, and this was one of them. Daniel did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked at me one last time, as if confirming that I would not intervene, that I would not redirect the situation, and I did not, because this was never mine to explain, never mine to announce. The truth carries more weight when it comes from someone who recognizes it without being told, and I had waited too long to take that away. The air felt different now, heavier, quieter, as if the entire patio was holding its breath without realizing it, and in that stillness, with every eye beginning to turn, with every conversation fading into the background, Daniel finally shifted his attention fully back to Vanessa, his voice low, controlled, but firm in a way that cut through everything else, and I knew before he even spoke that nothing about this night would ever look the same to them again. The night did not end with raised voices or dramatic exits. It ended in something far more unfamiliar to my family, silence that could not be filled with laughter or redirected with another story, the kind of silence that forces people to sit with what they have just witnessed. And in the days that followed, that silence followed them too, settling into conversations that used to move easily, lingering in the pauses where my name was no longer spoken the same way. Vanessa stopped making jokes about my office job, not because someone told her to, but because the version of me she had relied on no longer existed in her mind, and Daniel, to his credit, never exposed more than necessary. He did not announce anything publicly. He did not turn it into a spectacle. He simply adjusted, the way people do when they realize they have been standing in the wrong place all along, and that was enough. As for me, I left the next morning before anyone else was awake, the house quiet, the air still, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than empty, and for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to explain myself, not to them, not to anyone, because clarity does not always come from being understood by others. Sometimes it comes from understanding yourself well enough that their version of you no longer holds weight. Life after that night did not suddenly become perfect. Families do not rewrite themselves overnight. But something shifted in me that mattered more. I stopped waiting for recognition from people who had never truly seen me. I stopped shrinking to fit into spaces that required me to be smaller than I am. And I learned that boundaries are not walls you build to keep people out. They are lines you draw to remind yourself where you begin and where you end. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that your value does not decrease just because someone else fails to recognize it. And more importantly, you do not owe anyone access to parts of you that they have not earned the capacity to understand. Protect your time, protect your energy, protect your peace, because those are the things no one can give back to you once they are taken. And if you are listening to this right now, sitting somewhere in your own life feeling overlooked, underestimated, or quietly dismissed, I want you to know this. There is nothing wrong with you for not being understood by the wrong people. Sometimes that is not rejection. Sometimes that is protection. Sometimes God or the universe is simply guiding you away from places where your truth would never be seen clearly. Trust that, even when it feels lonely, even when it feels unfair. Because clarity always comes, not always when you want it, but always when you are ready to stand in it. Take care of yourself in real ways, not just emotionally, but practically. Build independence, understand your finances, know your worth in rooms where no one is saying it out loud, and never let someone else's limited perspective define the scale of your life. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for holding space for something that so many people experience but rarely say out loud. If this meant something to you, if it felt familiar in a way that stayed with you, share where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. And stay connected, because no one should feel like they are navigating this alone. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 42 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never let anyone else decide who you are before you do.